Sophie's earliest memories are filled with the sounds of arguing. The voice of Daniel, her father, echoed throughout the small house, making the walls shake. Victoria, her mother, tried to stay calm, perhaps thinking of Sophie and her little sister Madeline, but sometimes she couldn't help but argue. Sophie was only 7 years old at the time, and Madeline was only a 2-year-old child, too young to understand what was going on. One morning, Sophie forever remembered the image of her mother gently combing Madeline's hair and singing a sweet lullaby. That was also the last time Sophie saw her mother do that. That day, the screaming started again, more intense than ever. "I really can't stand it," Victoria shouted, her voice breaking. "You control everything I do, even who I talk to." And so the divorce happened quickly, like a storm that could not be avoided. One day, her mother disappeared. Daniel told the 2 children that Victoria had left them to pursue alcohol and other men. Sophie is not old enough to distinguish right from wrong, just enough to feel betrayed and hurt. She believed in her father's words absolutely. Not long after, Victoria appeared in their lives. She was young, always smiling, and seemed to adore Madeline. Madeline quickly came to see her as a mother, calling her mom after just a few weeks. But Sophie couldn't do it. She misses her real mother. "Where are you, Mom? Why didn't you call? Why didn't you fight to see us?" These questions haunted Sophie throughout her childhood, but she learned to keep them inside. Sophie gradually learned to live with the void her mother left behind, but the pain never went away. While Madeline grew closer to Victoria, her stepmother who showered her with glamorous dresses and ballet classes, Sophie felt increasingly isolated. Victoria tried to approach her, often trying to hug her or do her hair, but Sophie always avoided it. Those times, Daniel would say sternly, "Sophie, you have to be grateful. Victoria is doing her best for this family." But how can she be grateful when the only person she wants by her side is her real mother? As Madeline happily shows off her accomplishments from ballet classes and shopping trips with Victoria, Sophie turns to books for escape. The pages of books became her private world, where she did not have to face painful realities. Instead of participating in the family activities that Daniel and Victoria tried to organize, she spent her time in her room, planning for the future. Sophie believes that the only way to escape the feeling of lostness and deep sadness is through education. Readers can clearly feel the injustice that Sophie has to endure. Not only did she lose her mother, but she also had to face indifference from her new family. How can a child heal when those around her just want her to forget the past? This is when the audience needs to support Sophie. She is trying to build a future for herself, overcoming trauma with strong will. Sophie needs encouragement to continue pursuing her dreams. The advice for her is to never give up asserting her self-worth. Audiences can support by seeing Sophie's journey as a symbol of resilience and courage. Sophie finally got what she always wanted, a scholarship to her dream university. Leaving the house filled with painful memories and invisible pressure, she felt freedom for the first time in her life. The dorm room is small, but for Sophie, it is like a refuge, a new beginning. Without judgmental eyes or reproaches, she began to build the life she had always dreamed of, gradually discovering herself through books, new friends, and inspiring classes. But family life still did not let her go. During each vacation, Sophie returns hoping to reconnect with her sister Madeline. But instead of finding closeness, she only received distance. Madeline has completely become Victoria's princess, from the way she dresses to the way she thinks. In every conversation, Madeline frequently mentioned the plans Victoria and Daniel had made for her, from choosing a husband to skipping college to start a family. The dreams Madeline once shared with Sophie are now just distant memories. When Sophie tried to encourage her sister to think independently, Madeline just shook her head, thinking that Sophie was putting too much importance on the matter. This deeply disappointed Sophie, but she also understood that her sister had grown up surrounded by Victoria's strong influence. Audiences can feel Sophie's pain as she sees Madeline give up on herself, but they will also admire Sophie's determination as she refuses to give up protecting her sister from societal pressures. Sophie needs to continue to emphasize the value of independence and education to Madeline. Her journey is proof that freedom and success only come when we dare to step out of our comfort zone, no matter the difficulties. The audience will continue to support Sophie, who is trying not only for herself, but also for her sister's future. When Sophie graduated from college, she felt like she had entered a whole new world. The small apartment she rented from her accounting job's salary gave her the independence she craved. However, that joy is quickly disturbed when Madeline marries Marcus in a lavish wedding that Victoria organizes. Standing at the party, Sophie couldn't help but feel out of place, as everyone gathered to praise Victoria for preparing her daughter for a perfect future. Madeline, with shining eyes, was completely convinced that she had chosen the right path. But just a year later, Sophie discovered a completely different reality. Madeline frequently comes to her apartment, not to chat, but to deliver her two young children, James and Emma, on the grounds that she needs time to herself. At first, Sophie did not hesitate to help, thinking it was a way to get closer to her sister. But this quickly became an unexpected burden. Sleepless nights due to Emma's crying or James's restless hyperactivity were starting to seriously affect Sophie's work and mental health. When Sophie asked Madeline to find another solution, she only received rejection. "I'm the children's aunt," Madeline said, her tone as if this care were an obvious duty. Victoria is no different, frequently emphasizing that family is about sacrificing for each other. But Sophie begins to wonder, is this really a sacrifice for her family? Or is she simply being taken advantage of? The audience will feel the injustice that Sophie has to endure, but will also understand that this is a turning point for her to face and set boundaries for herself. Sophie needs to find a way to be clear with Madeline about her role, not as a nanny, but as a loving sister who wants to help, but in a limited capacity. This is the time for Sophie to stand up for herself, so as not to get caught up in the spiral of control from her family again. Tensions reach a boiling point one Tuesday morning, as Sophie tries to complete an important project at work. James, with his hyperactive nature, jumped from the sofa to the floor despite Sophie's repeated warnings. Meanwhile, Emma started crying because she couldn't find her favorite stuffed elephant. Sophie bounced between comforting Emma and dealing with James, but when she heard a loud thud, she turned around only to see James crying from a large bruise on his leg. When Madeline came to pick up the children, instead of being sympathetic, she exploded. "Can't you fulfill this small responsibility?" Her voice was harsh. The accusations continued to rain down on Sophie, ending with, "Maybe you should never have been trusted in the first place." Those words seemed to stab Sophie, but instead of retreating like usual, this time she stood up. "If you can't watch your children, don't expect someone else to do it for free," Sophie replied, her voice cold but determined. "I have a job and a life, and I'm not your nanny." The feelings of helplessness and fatigue that had accumulated over the years suddenly turned into strength. Sophie didn't just close the door on Madeline that day. She also closed the door that had made her feel taken advantage of all this time. Even though she knew that this would hurt their relationship, Sophie had no other choice. She realized that to live true to herself, she had to set clear boundaries. Sophie is not a heartless person, but continuing to suffer will only harm her more. For those watching, this story is not only about setting personal limits, but also a reminder that no one can ask you to sacrifice yourself for the good of others. Sophie's actions are not selfish, but self-love and self-protection. Sophie knew her actions would have consequences, and they happened more quickly than she expected. Less than an hour after Madeline left, Sophie's phone vibrated repeatedly. Her father, Roger, called first, his voice filled with indignation. "Sophie, what did you just do? Madeline is crying. You can't treat your sister like that." He scolded Sophie, issuing his usual threat. "If you keep doing this, don't expect to hear anything from this family again." Sophie held the phone firmly, feeling anger flare up in her chest. "Dad, this isn't fair," she replied, trying to keep her voice calm. "I don't refuse to help my family, but I can't put my entire life on hold because of endless demands. I have a job, a life of my own, and I can't do everything alone." The next calls came from Sarah and several relatives. They talked about family responsibilities, about Sophie having to make sacrifices, but she didn't listen any further. After turning off her phone, Sophie sat in her quiet apartment, thinking about everything that had happened. She knew she had just hurt her family, but for the first time, she felt free. This was the first time she set clear boundaries, not out of selfishness, but out of self-esteem. A few days later, Sophie received a surprise call from her cousin Rachel, who had heard about it through her family. "You did the right thing," Rachel said. "You can't let them take advantage of you forever. If they really care, they will understand." Rachel's words were the encouragement Sophie needed. It reminded her that setting boundaries does not take away love. It just reinforces that love requires respect on both sides. Sophie begins to see that she is not alone. Many people around her are also facing family pressure, and her actions can be an inspiration for them to stand up for themselves. Sophie's story is not just about personal struggle, but also a reminder that in American culture, where independence and autonomy are valued, standing up for your rights is never wrong. A few weeks after the incident, Sophie began to feel an unusual silence from her family. Her phone vibrated less, and there were no more scolding messages. But that didn't give her any relief. Instead, it made her feel like she was standing in the eye of a storm. When Sophie decided to check social media, she discovered a post from her father. "It's heartbreaking that a daughter refuses to help her family when it's needed most. We did everything for her." But selfishness and ingratitude broke this family. Sophie sat silently in front of the screen. Old family photos were posted, accompanied by hundreds of comments from friends, relatives, and even strangers expressing sympathy for her father. Some people call Sophie an irresponsible daughter. The criticism hurt, but she knew that this was her family's way of manipulating public opinion to create pressure. Instead of responding immediately, Sophie decided to do something she never thought she had the courage to do. She posted a candid post. "I love my family, but love does not mean letting others take advantage of you. I have sacrificed my time, my work, and my mental health to accommodate them. Never-ending demands. It's time for me to set boundaries. This is not about selfishness, it's about protecting myself." The response to Sophie's post was unexpectedly more positive than she thought. Friends, colleagues, even people she didn't know, sent messages of encouragement. "You did it right. You don't owe anyone anything." Sophie begins to realize that she is not alone in facing pressure from her family, especially in American culture, where independence and the right to protect yourself are highly valued. Sophie's actions were more than a personal statement. It is also a reminder that everyone deserves love and respect, but that should never come at the expense of unconditional sacrifice. She didn't seek support, but she found strength in her community. After Sophie's public post, her family did not stay silent for long. Her father called constantly, each call leaving a different message, from vague apologies to angry threats. Sophie listened to each message with a feeling of both heartbreak and relief. She knew that she had stepped out of the vicious cycle of control and manipulation. But that doesn't lessen the sadness of realizing her family still doesn't understand her decision. One day, Sophie receives a handwritten letter from her mother, who has hitherto had little involvement in family tensions. The letter said, "I know you feel hurt, and perhaps you think I didn't do enough to protect you. But I hope that one day you will understand that I, too, am trapped in this cycle, this vortex." The letter surprised Sophie. It wasn't a full apology, but it was a step forward that she hadn't expected. Sophie began to think about the meaning of forgiveness, not to accept injustice, but to free herself from pain. She decides to keep her distance, but is willing to open up if her family really changes. In American culture, setting boundaries does not mean giving up on family, but finding a new balance. Sophie begins to focus on the future, with the hope that time and maturity will bring healing. A week after receiving the letter from her mother, Sophie decided to meet her at a small cafe in town. When Mother walked in, she looked different. No longer had her familiar tough exterior, but instead had a tired look, as if the years had weighed heavily on her shoulders. Sophie sat there, quietly waiting. When Mom started speaking, her voice was shaky, but full of sincerity. "I'm sorry for not doing more to protect you. I was afraid of confronting your father, and I chose silence instead of standing up. But now I realize I lost you." Those words touched Sophie, melting some of the ice she had built to protect her heart. She wasn't completely forgiving, but she felt sincerity, an important first step. Sophie shares her feelings, not shying away from the hurt and disappointment she has endured. The conversation wasn't perfect, but it offered a glimmer of hope. The audience can see here a lesson in courage when facing the truth and trying to heal relationships. Sophie chooses to open her heart but still maintain her boundaries, a strong action that shows maturity and determination. This is a reminder that, in American culture, forgiveness and reconciliation are not weak, but a journey that takes time and effort from both sides. Audiences can support Sophie by recognizing her strength and standing up for herself, but also encouraging her to continue laying the foundation for lasting healing. In the end, Sophie decided that healing with her mother did not mean forgetting the hurt, but choosing to continue moving forward. Their relationship wasn't perfect, but sincerity on both sides created the foundation for a new beginning. Sophie sets clear boundaries, but is also open to change. The audience can see Sophie as a model of strength and tolerance. She created herself the opportunity to rebuild family bonds, but still maintained her own values. A word of advice for Sophie: continue to protect your heart, but don't give up hope for healing.